Imagine a man who had it all: wealth, power, a skyline bowing at his feet, until a single moment by a quiet river unraveled everything he thought he knew. A secret buried for years, a voice from the past, and a choice that could redeem or ruin him forever. What happens next will leave you questioning what honor really means. Want to find out? Hit that like button and subscribe now. Trust me, you won't want to miss a single chapter of this journey. The air hung heavy with the scent of damp earth as Edward Grayson stepped out of his Bentley, the sleek black car gleaming faintly under the muted light of a fading afternoon. The Hudson River flowed quietly beyond the cemetery, its surface a mirror of gray clouds stretching endlessly above. In his hand, he clutched a bouquet of white carnations, their petals soft against his calloused fingers. He paused, his breath catching as his eyes settled on the headstone ahead. Clara Grayson, etched in simple, unassuming letters. 15 years had passed since he'd last seen her, since he'd walked away from their modest home by this very river. Now at 60, with Grayson Energy towering over the energy sector, he stood here, a titan of industry, feeling strangely hollow. The gravel crunched under his polished shoes as he approached, each step deliberate, as if testing the ground beneath him. He'd built an empire on discipline, on the unyielding resolve that had carried him from a scrappy entrepreneur to a billionaire chairman. Yet today, that resolve faltered. He hadn't come for closure. He wasn't sure what he'd come for. Maybe it was the weight of a milestone, the company's latest triumph that had stirred something dormant in him, or maybe it was the nagging emptiness that no boardroom victory could fill. He stopped a few feet from the grave, the carnations trembling slightly in his grip. Clara had loved these flowers, their quiet beauty a contrast to the chaos of his ambition. He remembered her arranging them in a chipped vase, her fingers deft and gentle, her smile soft as she hummed by the kitchen window. That was before he'd chosen the skyline of Manhattan over the stillness of their riverside life, before he'd convinced himself she couldn't keep up with his dreams. A small figure caught his eye, pulling him from the reverie. A boy, no more than 10, sat cross-legged beside the headstone, his dark hair tousled by the breeze. He wore a faded jacket too big for his frame, and his hands rested on a small, weathered stone he'd placed atop the grave. Edward frowned, his first instinct to call out, to demand who this child was trespassing on his moment. But then the boy looked up, his hazel eyes piercing through the dusk, and spoke. "Do you remember her?" His voice was clear, steady, cutting through the silence like a bell. "Mom said you were strong. She said you liked the river, but you never came back." Edward froze, the words sinking into him like stones into the Hudson. His throat tightened, a rare crack in the armor he'd worn for decades. "Who are you?" he managed, his tone sharper than intended. "Who told you to say that?" The boy tilted his head, unperturbed by Edward's edge. "Mom did. She said you'd come one day, but she didn't know when. She said you didn't. No, she needed you." The air seemed to thicken, pressing against Edward's chest. He took a step closer, the carnation slipping slightly in his hand. "What's your name, kid? Who's your mother?" "Ben," the boy answered simply, brushing dirt from his jeans as he stood. "My mom was Clara. She's right here." He patted the headstone with a small, calloused hand, a gesture so tender it made Edward's stomach twist. Clara, the name, hit him like a quiet thunderclap, reverberating through the walls he'd built around his past. He stared at Ben, searching the boy's face, the sharp jaw, the steady gaze, for something familiar. Clara's eyes, perhaps? Or was it wishful thinking, a trick of the fading light? His mind raced, piecing together the impossible. Clara had been alone when he left. Or so he'd thought. He'd never heard of a child, never imagined she'd carried a piece of him into the silence he'd left behind. "Why are you here?" Edward asked, his voice softening despite the turmoil inside. He knelt slightly, bringing himself closer, to Ben's level, though the act felt foreign, awkward. "Mom liked it here," Ben said, shrugging as if it were obvious. "I come to talk to her. She said you'd bring flowers if you ever came, white ones, like those." He nodded at the carnations, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Edward's breath hitched. He looked down at the bouquet, the petals now damp from the mist rolling off the river. Clara had known him, really known him, down to the smallest details. He'd buried under years of boardroom battles and late-night deals. And this boy, this stranger with her eyes, carried her memory like a torch in the gathering dark. He straightened, his jaw tightening as he fought the flood of questions threatening to spill out. Who had raised Ben? Where had Clara been all these years? Why hadn't she told him? But beneath those questions lay a deeper ache, a whisper of guilt he couldn't silence. Had she needed him, truly needed him, and he'd been too consumed by his own pride to see it? I didn't know, he said finally, the words rough, almost lost to the wind. I didn't know about you. Ben studied him for a moment, then bent to pick up his stone, clutching it like a talisman. That's okay, he said, his voice small but steady. Mom said you were busy being strong, but she hoped you'd come anyway. Edward's chest tightened, a pang of something sharp and unfamiliar, regret, perhaps, cutting through his carefully guarded composure. He'd spent his life chasing strength, building a legacy that towered over cities. Yet here, in the shadow of Clara's grave, with this boy's words echoing in his ears, that strength felt like a hollow shell. What had it cost him? What had it cost her? The river murmured behind them, its quiet song a stark contrast to the storm brewing in Edward's mind. He set the carnations gently on the grave, his fingers lingering on the cool stone. I'm here now, he whispered, more to Clara than to Ben, though the boy watched him with those piercing eyes. As Ben turned to leave, disappearing into the dusk along the riverbank, Edward stood rooted to the spot. The silence stretched, heavy with questions he couldn't yet answer. But one thing was clear. The life he'd built, the honor he'd claimed, was about to be tested in ways he'd never imagined. The Manhattan skyline glittered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Edward Grayson's office, a constellation of steel and glass that stretched into the night. From the 47th floor of Grayson Energy's headquarters, the city sprawled beneath him like a kingdom he'd conquered, each tower a testament to his discipline, each deal a brick in the wall of his legacy. Yet tonight, as he sat behind the polished mahogany desk, the room felt stifling, the air thick with the scent of leather and stale ambition. The bouquet of white carnations lay discarded on a side table, their petals curling inward, a silent rebuke from the riverside cemetery he'd left hours ago. Edward leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking under his weight. His fingers brushed the edge of a small, locked drawer in the desk, a compartment he hadn't opened in years. The boy's words echoed in his mind, sharp and unrelenting. Mom said you were strong, but you didn't know she needed you. Ben. A child he hadn't known existed, standing by Clara's grave with a certainty that pierced through Edward's carefully constructed world. He'd driven back to the city in silence, the hum of the Bentley's engine no match for the questions roaring in his head. Who was Ben to Clara? To him? And why had she kept this secret? With a slow, deliberate motion, he unlocked the drawer and pulled it open. Inside lay relics of a life he'd buried. A faded photograph of Clara laughing by the Hudson, her hair catching the sunlight, a simple gold wedding band he'd slipped off his finger the day he left, and a letter, its edges yellowed, sealed with Clara's looping handwriting. He lifted the letter, his thumb tracing the ink of his name, Edward, as if touching it could summon her back. He hadn't read it when she sent it all those years ago. He'd been too busy signing contracts, too consumed by the fear of losing everything he'd built. Now, with trembling hands, he broke the seal. Dear Edward, the letter began, her words steady despite the faint tremor in the script. You've chosen your path and I've chosen mine. You wanted a life of power and I wanted one of love. I don't blame you for leaving. I know you think it's strength to walk away. But I wish you'd seen that strength isn't always in the things you build, but in the people you hold close. I'll be okay. We'll be okay. Goodbye. Edward's breath caught, the paper crinkling as his grip tightened. We'll be okay. The plural hit him like a punch to the gut. Clara hadn't been alone when she wrote this, not just her, but someone else. Ben. He set the letter down, his eyes drifting to the photograph. Clara's smile was radiant, her hand resting on her stomach in a way he hadn't noticed back then. Pregnant. She'd been pregnant and he'd walked away, too blinded by his own pride to see the life growing between them. He stood abruptly, crossing to the window where the city lights pulsed below. The view had once filled him with triumph, proof he'd risen above the chaos of his youth, above the doubts of those who'd called him reckless. But now, it mocked him. He pressed a hand to the cool glass, his reflection staring back. A man in a tailored suit, graying at the temples, with lines etched deep from years of control. Control he'd wielded like a weapon, cutting Clara out of his life when she'd begged him to stay. The memory flooded back unbidden. It was a humid summer evening, the river lapping at the shore outside their small house. Clara had stood in the doorway, her voice soft but firm. "Edward, we can make this work. You don't have to choose between me and your dreams." He'd turned away, his jaw set, his words cold. "You don't understand what it takes, Clara. I can't afford. Weakness, not yours, not mine." He'd left her there, her silhouette shrinking in the rearview mirror as he drove toward the city, toward the life he thought would define him. Weakness. He'd called her that, convinced himself her quiet strength, her patience, her love, was a liability. But she'd been the strong one, hadn't she? Raising a child alone, keeping Ben safe from the world Edward had built. A world of boardrooms and backstabbing, where honor was a currency traded for profit. He'd thought he was protecting his future by leaving her. Instead, he'd abandoned the only thing that mattered. The office phone buzzed, shattering the silence. Edward ignored it, his gaze fixed on the lights below. He could still hear Ben's voice, small but steady. "She said you liked the river, but you never came back." Clara had told the boy about him, about the man he'd been before the suits and the skyscrapers, a man who'd sit with her on the riverbank, dreaming aloud about a simpler life. What had she seen in him that he'd lost along the way? He returned, to the desk, picking up the wedding band. It was light in his palm, unadorned, a promise he'd broken. He slipped it onto his finger, the metal cold against his skin. It didn't fit anymore, not physically, not after years of wear and change, but it anchored him, a tether to the past he couldn't outrun. Clara's letter lay open beside the photograph, her words a quiet indictment of the life he'd chosen. Strength isn't always in the things you build, but in the people you hold close. Edward sank back into his chair, the city lights blurring through a sheen of unshed tears. For the first time in decades, he let himself feel the weight of what he'd lost, not just Clara, but the man he might have been. Ben's existence was a revelation, a crack in the fortress of his pride. He didn't know what came next, how to bridge 15 years of absence, how to face a son he'd never known. But one thing was certain, the honor he'd chased in boardrooms and headlines was a shadow of the dignity Clara had lived, the dignity he'd failed to see. The phone buzzed again, insistent, but Edward let it ring. Outside, the city hummed with its relentless rhythm. Inside, he sat in the glow of artificial lights, a billionaire alone with his regrets, wondering if it was too late to find his way back to the river. The little diner sat perched on a quiet bend of the Hudson, its weathered sign flickering in the early evening light. Inside, the air smelled of brewed coffee and warm bread, a humble contrast to the sterile luxury Edward Grayson had left behind in Manhattan. He slid into a booth by the window, the vinyl creaking under his tailored suit, his eyes tracing the river's gentle ripples beyond the glass. It was a place Clara would have loved, unpretentious, steady, like the flow of the water she'd once called home. He'd come here to meet Ellen, Clara's older sister, the one person who might hold the answers to the questions gnawing at him since Ben's words at the cemetery. Edward's fingers tapped the table, a rare sign of unease. From a man who'd faced down boardroom titans without flinching, the wedding band still sat heavy on his finger, a reminder of the letter he'd read last night. Clara's quiet farewell, her cryptic, "We'll be okay." Ben's face flashed in his mind, those hazel eyes so like Clara's, carrying a weight no 10-year-old should bear. Edward needed to know the truth, Not just for himself, but for the woman he'd failed, the one whose memory now tugged at the edges of his carefully controlled world. The bell above the door jingled, and Ellen stepped in. She was a sturdy woman in her late 60s, her silver hair pulled back in a no-nonsense bun, her face lined with years of hard-earned wisdom. She carried a worn canvas bag, its straps frayed, and her gaze settled on Edward with a mix of wariness and recognition. She slid into the booth across from him, setting the bag beside her like a shield. "You look older than I expected," she said, her voice dry but not unkind. "Clara always said you'd age like the river, slow and steady. Guess she was wrong about that." Edward's lips twitched, a flicker of a smile he quickly suppressed. "I didn't come here to talk about my wrinkles, Ellen. I need to know about the boy, Ben. Who is he to Clara? To me?" Ellen studied him, her eyes narrowing as if weighing his worth. She leaned back, folding her arms. "You sure you're ready for this, Edward? You walked away from her once. What makes you think you deserve to know now?" The question stung, a jab at the pride he'd worn like armor for decades. He could have snapped back, reminded her of his wealth, his power, the things that had defined him, but he didn't. Instead, he met her gaze, his voice low and steady. "I don't deserve it, but I'm here anyway. Tell me." Ellen sighed, a sound heavy with years of silence. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small photograph, sliding it across the table. It was Clara, younger, her arms wrapped around a toddler with dark hair and a gap-toothed grin. Edward's breath caught as he recognized those eyes. Ben's eyes, Clara's eyes, staring back at him from a moment he'd never known. "That's Ben," Ellen said. "Your son. Clara was pregnant when you left her. She didn't tell you, because she knew you'd try to drag her into your world, or worse, walk away from him too." Edward's hand trembled as he picked up the photo, his thumb brushing Clara's frozen smile. His son. The word echoed in his chest, a truth he'd sensed but hadn't dared to name. He'd left Clara alone, pregnant, with no one to lean on, but herself. The weight of it settled over him like the river's current, slow and unrelenting. "Why didn't she reach out?" he asked, his voice rough. "I could have helped. I could have given them everything." Ellen's laugh was short, bitter. "Everything? You mean money, Edward? Clara didn't want your checks. She didn't want Ben growing up in that world of yours full of lights and lies. She took a job at a bookstore, lived in a one-bedroom apartment with a leaky roof. She stitched his clothes by hand when they tore, read him stories by the river when the power got cut off. That was her everything." The image hit Edward hard. Clara bent over a needle under a dim lamp, her fingers calloused, her voice soft as she spun tales for a boy he'd never met. He'd been signing multi-million-dollar deals while she'd been counting pennies to keep their son warm. His throat tightened, a rare crack in his composure, but he held it together, his jaw set against the flood of guilt. "She was stronger than I ever gave her credit for," he said quietly, more to himself than to Ellen. "Damn, right she was," Ellen replied, her tone softening. "Clara didn't need your pity or your power. She chose the river over your skyscrapers, chose Ben over your pride. She kept him away from you because she thought you'd turn him into someone like you, cold, driven, alone." The words cut, deeper than Edward expected, slicing through the layers of self-respect he'd built. He'd prided himself on his discipline, his ability to rise above emotion, to control every outcome. But Clara had seen through it, seen the loneliness he'd masked with success, and she'd protected Ben from it, even at the cost of her own comfort. He set the photo down, his fingers lingering on its edges. "Where is he now? Who's taking care of him?" "I am," Ellen said simply. "Since Clara passed 2 years ago. Cancer took her fast, too fast for her to tell you herself. She didn't want to burden you, even at the end." Cancer. The word landed like a stone in his gut. Clara had faced it alone, shielding Ben, shielding him, while he'd been negotiating contracts and sipping scotch at galas. He closed his eyes briefly, the diner's hum fading as he pictured her. Thin, frail, but still smiling for Ben, still holding on to the dignity he'd never understood. "I want to see him," Edward said, opening his eyes to meet Ellen's steady gaze. Not to take him away, just to know him, to make this right. Ellen didn't answer right away. She picked up the photo, tucking it back into her bag, then stood. That's not my call, Edward. It's Ben's. And maybe Clara's if she's still watching. Come by the house tomorrow. We'll see what he thinks. She left him there, the bell jingling as she stepped out into the dusk. Edward stayed, staring at the river through the window, its flow a quiet mirror to the turmoil inside him. Clara's strength, her real strength, had been in her silence, her sacrifice. And now, for the first time, he saw his own honor not in the empire he'd built, but in the family Austin might still have a chance to reclaim. The Waldorf Astoria's grand ballroom shimmered under the glow of crystal chandeliers, the clink of champagne flutes mingling with the murmur of power brokers and socialites. Edward Grayson stood near the edge of the room, his tailored tuxedo, a perfect fit, his silver hair catching the light. It was Grayson Energy's annual gala, a night to celebrate record profits, to solidify alliances, to bask in the glow of his empire. Yet tonight, the air felt thick, the opulence of fragile veneer over the unease coiling in his chest. Ellen's words from the diner lingered like a shadow. She kept him away from you because she thought you'd turn him into someone like you, cold, driven, alone. And Ben, his son, waited somewhere beyond this glittering facade. A truth Edward couldn't yet touch. He sipped his scotch, the burn grounding him as he scanned the room. Colleagues nodded in his direction, their smiles tight with the deference his title commanded. But the whispers had already begun. A low hum beneath, the string quartet's melody. He'd felt it the moment he arrived, the sidelong glances, the hushed tones. Something was brewing, and it wasn't about the company's latest merger. A flash of light caught his eye. Cameras. Reporters had slipped past security, their lenses trained on him like hawks circling prey. A young woman in a sharp blazer pushed forward, microphone in hand, her voice cutting through the din. Mr. Grayson, is it true you have a secret son? Sources say you abandoned your family years ago. What's your response? The room stilled, heads turning, the weight of 100, eyes pressing against him. Edward's grip tightened on the glass, but his face remained a mask of calm, a skill honed over decades of boardroom battles. He set the drink down on a passing waiter's tray, his movements deliberate, and faced the reporter with a steady gaze. I don't comment on rumors, he said, his voice low but firm, carrying the quiet authority that had silenced doubters before. This is a night to celebrate Grayson Energy's achievements, not to indulge in speculation. The reporter opened her mouth to press further, but a murmur rippled through the crowd as another figure emerged. Victor Langston, his lean frame cutting a sharp silhouette against the golden light. Edward's jaw tightened. Victor, once his closest ally, now his bitterest rival, wore a smirk that promised trouble. His dark suit was impeccable, his graying beard trimmed to a point, but his eyes glinted with the malice of a man who'd waited years for this moment. Edward, Victor drawled loud enough to draw every ear. Always the master of deflection. But let's not pretend tonight's about your precious company. The world's finally seeing the real you, a man who builds empires on sand and leaves his own blood to drown. The accusation hung in the air, sharp and venomous. Edward felt the sting, a direct hit to the pride he'd guarded so fiercely. Victor knew. Somehow, he knew about Ben. A leak perhaps from a disgruntled employee, or worse, a calculated betrayal. The room buzzed with anticipation, waiting for Edward to strike back, to match Victor's venom with his own. But he didn't. He stood still, his hands clasped behind his back, his breathing slow despite the fire simmering beneath his skin. You've always had a flair for drama, Victor, Edward said evenly, his tone measured, almost conversational. But I'm not here to play your game. Say what you came to say, then leave. Victor's smirk widened, relishing the challenge. He stepped closer, lowering his voice but ensuring it carried. Oh, I will. I've got proof. Documents, witnesses, showing. You walked out on Clara Grayson and a kid you didn't even bother to name. The great Edward Grayson, abandoning his family while he climbed over men like me to get here. I wonder what your investors will think when this hits the papers tomorrow." The threat landed like a stone, cold and heavy. Edward's mind raced. Victor wasn't bluffing. He remembered their falling out 15 years ago, when Edward had cut Victor out of a pivotal deal to secure Grayson Energy's future. Victor had lost everything: his stake, his reputation, while Edward had soared. This was revenge, pure and calculated, aimed not just at his wealth but at the honor he'd claimed as his own. The crowd shifted, a mix of shock and curiosity flickering across their faces. Edward could feel the tide turning, the whispers growing, into a roar. He could deny it, spin a story, call Victor a liar and let his lawyers bury the mess. But Clara's face flashed before him, her quiet strength, her sacrifice, and Ben's voice echoed. "She said you didn't know she needed you. Lies wouldn't honor them. Running wouldn't either." "I don't fear you, Victor," Edward said, his voice rising just enough to command the room. "Nor do I fear the truth. If you've got something to say, put it out there. I'll face it. Not because I owe you, but because I owe her." And her eye blinked, caught off guard by the steadiness in Edward's tone. The room held its breath, the cameras flashing, but Edward didn't flinch. He'd spent his life controlling outcomes, bending the world to his will. Now, for the first time, he let go, not out of weakness but out of a dignity he was only beginning to grasp. Whatever Victor threw at him, he'd take it standing, not for his reputation, but for the family he'd failed. Victor recovered quickly, his sneer returning. "You'll regret that, Grayson. By morning, your name will be mud. Enjoy your last night in the spotlight." He turned on his heel, disappearing into the throng as the reporters surged forward shouting questions. Edward raised a hand, silencing them with a look, then walked toward the exit, his steps deliberate, his head high. The gala's glamour faded behind him, the noise swallowed by the hum of his own thoughts. Outside, the night air hit him, cool and sharp, the distant river glinting under the city lights. Victor's words stung, but they didn't break him. For years he'd measured his worth in headlines and profits. Now, facing the storm ahead, he saw a different measure: Clara's resilience, Ben's trust. His honor wasn't in the spotlight, but in the quiet resolve to make things right, no matter the cost. He slid into the Bentley, the engine purring to life. Tomorrow he'd see Ben. Tomorrow he'd begin to rebuild what he'd lost, not with money, but with the strength Clara had always believed he had. The sun dipped low over the Hudson, casting a golden sheen across the river's surface as Edward Grayson pulled up to the modest house Ellen had described. It was a weathered clapboard cottage, its paint peeling in strips, the front porch sagging under the weight of time. A single rocking chair swayed gently in the breeze, and a row of wildflowers, Clara's touch, no doubt, lined the path to the door. Edward stepped out of the Bentley, the gravel crunching beneath his shoes, his chest tight with a mix of anticipation and dread. After Victor's ambush at the gala last night, the city buzzed with rumors. But here, by the river, the world felt quieter, more honest. He was here for Ben, for Clara, and no headline could change that. Ellen opened the door before he could knock, her expression guarded, but not hostile. "He's inside," she said, stepping aside. "Be gentle with him, Edward. He's not used to men like you." Edward nodded, his throat dry as he crossed the threshold. The house smelled of old books and faint lavender, a scent that tugged at memories of Clara's presence. The living room was small, cluttered with mismatched furniture, a threadbare couch, a wooden table scarred with years of use. Ben sat on the floor near a bookshelf, his dark hair falling into his eyes as he turned the pages of a worn picture book. He looked up, those hazel eyes meeting Edward's, and for a moment time seemed to pause. "Hey," Edward said softly, lowering himself to one knee a few feet away. "Mind if I sit with you?" Ben shrugged, a small gesture of acceptance. And Edward settled onto the floor, his tailored suit out of place against the faded rug. The boy's silence wasn't cold, just cautious, like a river testing its banks. Edward searched for words, something to bridge the gap of 15 lost years, but before he could speak, Ben reached into a cardboard box beside him and pulled out a leather-bound notebook, its edges frayed. "This was Mom's," Ben said, his voice steady but quiet. "She wrote stuff in it, said I should show you if you ever came." Edward's pulse quickened as he took the notebook, his fingers brushing the worn cover. Clara's handwriting stared back at him from the first page, neat, deliberate, a piece of her preserved in ink. He glanced at Ben, who nodded encouragingly, then began to read. October 12, 2013, it started, the date a jolt, 5 years after he'd left her. "Ben's 3 today. He asked about his dad again, and I told him you're out there building something big. He doesn't understand yet, but I do. You always thought strength was in letting go, Edward. But I've found mine in holding on. Doctor says my heart's failing. Congenital, they call it. I could fight it, but the treatments would take everything we have. Ben needs a future more than I need more time. So I'll keep going, for him. And maybe one day you'll see what I saw in you." Edward's breath caught, the words sinking into him like stones into the river outside. He turned the page, his hands trembling as Clara's story unfolded. She'd known she was dying, had known for years, yet she'd chosen Ben over herself. Entry after entry detailed her quiet resolve, selling her jewelry to pay for his shoes, working late at the bookstore despite chest pains, teaching him to read by the river when she could barely stand. One line burned into his mind. "I don't regret keeping him from you, Edward. You weren't ready then. I hope you are now." He closed the notebook, his vision blurring with tears he fought to hold back. Clara hadn't just raised Ben alone. She'd sacrificed her life for him, a choice so selfless it shattered the pride Edward had clung to. He'd been chasing power while she'd been pouring hers into a boy he'd never known existed. The weight of it pressed against his chest, a grief he couldn't name. "Mom said you'd be sad," Ben said, breaking the silence. He scooted, closer, his small hand resting on the notebook. "She didn't want that. She said you'd come when you were ready, and I should tell you it's okay." Edward looked at Ben, the boy's steady gaze cutting through his turmoil. "Sad doesn't cover it," he admitted, his voice rough but gentle. "I didn't know, Ben. About you, about her. I should have been here." Ben tilted his head, considering him. "She said you were busy being strong, but she hoped you'd come anyway. Are you staying now?" The question hung between them, simple, yet piercing. Edward swallowed hard, the echoes of Victor's threats and the media's frenzy fading into the background. None of it mattered. Not the headlines. Not the empire. Compared to this moment. This child who carried Clara's spirit. He'd spent his life controlling everything, but here, in this cramped little house, he felt powerless in a way that wasn't weakness, but surrender. "I want to," he said, the words raw, honest. "If you'll let me. I don't know how, to be a father, Ben, but I'd like to try, for you and for her." Ben studied him, then nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Okay. Mom said you'd figure it out. She was good at knowing stuff." Edward let out a shaky breath, a mix of relief and resolve settling over him. Clara's faith in him, written in those pages, reflected in Ben's trust, was a lifeline he hadn't earned but desperately needed. He'd failed her once, blinded by a warped sense of honor that prized success over love. Now, her sacrifice laid bare the truth. Dignity wasn't in the things he'd built, but in the lives he could still touch. Ellen appeared in the doorway, her arms crossed, watching them, with a guarded softness. "He likes you," she said, nodding at Ben. "That's a start, but it's up to him, Edward, don't push." "I won't," Edward promised, standing slowly, the notebook still in his hand. He looked down at Ben, who'd returned to his book, then back at Ellen. "Thank you, for keeping him, for keeping her alive in him." Ellen shrugged, but her eyes softened. "It's what family does. You've got a lot to prove, Grayson. Start tomorrow." As Edward stepped onto the porch, the river's murmur filled the evening air, a quiet companion to the storm inside him. Clara's words burned in his memory. I hope you're ready now. He wasn't. Not fully, but for the first time, he wanted to be. The path ahead was uncertain, but it led back to the river, back to the honor he'd lost, and maybe, just maybe, back to the man Clara had believed he could be. The conference room at Grayson Energy's headquarters thrummed with tension. The air thick with the scent of polished wood and nervous anticipation. Edward Grayson stood at the head of the long table, his hands clasped behind his back, his gray eyes fixed on the wall of windows overlooking Manhattan's skyline. The board of directors sat in a semicircle before him, their faces a mix of unease and expectation, while a cluster of reporters hovered near the door, cameras poised like vultures. The morning headlines had hit hard. Grayson's secret son, a legacy of abandonment, and Victor Langston's venom had spread faster than Edward could contain. This was no ordinary meeting. It was a crucible, and Edward knew it. Victor strode in last, his lean frame cutting through the room like a blade, his smirk sharp enough to draw blood. He carried a thick manila folder, its edges crisp, and dropped it onto the table with a deliberate thud. Gentlemen, he began, his voice smooth and theatrical, and ladies of the press, I'm here to finish what Edward started, or rather, what he ran from. The proof's all here. Emails, bank records, even a signed affidavit from a former assistant. He knew about Clara and the kid years ago, and paid to keep them quiet. The room erupted in murmurs, the board shifting uncomfortably, the cameras flashing. Edward felt the weight of every eye, every whisper, pressing against the calm he'd fought to maintain since reading Clara's notebook. Victor's accusation was a lie, a fabrication woven from half-truths and malice. But it didn't matter. The damage was done, the narrative set. He could see it in the board's faces. Doubt creeping in, trust fraying at the edges. Victor leaned forward, his hands splayed on the table, his gaze locked on Edward. You built this company on integrity, didn't you, Grayson? That's what you've sold us all these years. But it's a sham. You abandoned your family, paid them off, and now you're scrambling to save face. Step down, or I'll bury you deeper than Clara's grave. The mention of Clara's name ignited a spark in Edward's chest, a flare of heat he quickly tamped down. He could have lunged across the table, could have let the fury bubbling beneath his skin spill over into words or fists. But he didn't. He stood still, his breathing slow, his voice a low, steady rumble when he finally spoke. You're good at stories, Victor, Edward said, his tone calm, almost reflective. You always were. But I'm not here to fight you with lies or fists. You want the truth? I'll give it to you. And them. He nodded toward the board, the reporters, the room now hanging on his every word. He stepped forward, his hands unclasping to rest lightly on the table, his posture open, unguarded. I didn't know about Ben until 2 days ago. I didn't pay Clara to stay quiet. She never asked for a dime. I left her 15 years ago because I thought success was strength, and she didn't fit into that picture. I was wrong. She was the strong one, raising our son alone, giving him a life I never could have back then. She died protecting him, not me. If that's abandonment, then I'm guilty. But I'm not hiding from it anymore. The room fell silent, the air thick with the raw honesty of his confession. Victor's smirk faltered, his eyes narrowing as he sensed the shift. The board leaned forward, the reporters scribbled furiously, but Edward kept going, his voice rising just enough to carry the weight of his resolve. You've got your folder, Victor, he continued, nodding at the pile of papers. Go ahead. Spread it around. I won't stop you, but I won't step down either, not because I need this chair, but because I owe it to Clara and Ben to face what's coming. I've spent my life controlling everything, money, deals, people. Now I'm letting go, not out of weakness, but because it's the only way to make this right. Victor straightened, his confidence cracking. You think this saves you? He snapped, his voice sharp with desperation. The board won't stand for a scandal. Your investors will pull out. You're finished, Edward. Admit it. Edward met his gaze, unflinching. Maybe. But I'm not finished for the reasons you think. I don't need their approval, or yours, to know who I am now. I'm Ben's father, Clara's husband, even if I failed them once. That's my honor. Victor, not this company. Take your shot. I'll stand here and take it. The room held its breath, the tension a living thing. Victor hesitated, then shoved the folder toward the nearest board member, a gray-haired woman named Margaret who'd always admired Edward's resolve. She opened it, scanned the pages, forged emails, doctored receipts, and set it down with a frown. "This doesn't add up," she said, her voice cutting through the silence. "Dates are off. Signatures don't match. It's a stretch, Victor." A ripple of doubt spread through the board, the reporters exchanging glances. Victor's, face reddened, but Edward didn't gloat. He didn't need to. He'd faced the fire, not with anger, not with violence, but with the quiet strength Clara had seen in him, the strength he was only now beginning to claim. "I move we table this," Margaret said, her tone firm. "Edward's given us his side. Let's verify the rest before we act." The board murmured agreement, and Victor stormed out, his folder left behind like a discarded weapon. The reporters surged toward Edward, shouting questions, but he raised a hand, his voice steady. "I've said what I needed to. The rest is for my family, not the papers." He walked out, the cameras flashing in his wake, his steps measured as he descended to the lobby and climbed into the Bentley. The city blurred past, but his mind was on the river, on Ben's small hand clutching that notebook, on Clara's words. "I hope you're ready now." He'd faced Victor's lies, the board's scrutiny, without breaking, without losing himself. It wasn't about saving his job. It was about proving he could stand for something more. The car hummed toward the Hudson, toward Ben and Ellen, toward the life he'd abandoned and now longed to reclaim. The storm wasn't over. Victor wouldn't stop. The headlines would rage. But Edward felt a calm he hadn't known in years. His honor wasn't in the chair he'd kept, but in the truth he'd spoken, the dignity he'd held, and the sun waiting by the river. The late afternoon sun filtered through the tall windows of Edward Grayson's Westchester estate, casting warm patches of light across the hardwood floors. For years, the sprawling mansion had been a silent monument to his success. Marble counters, vaulted ceilings, a view of rolling hills that stretched toward the horizon. But today, it felt different. The air carried the faint crackle of a fire. In the hearth, the scent of burning oak mingling with something softer, more grounding, wood smoke and the promise of home. Edward sat on a low stool by the fireplace, his sleeves rolled up, a pair of mismatched fishing rods resting against the wall beside him. Across from him, Ben knelt on a rug, his small hands fumbling with a spool of line, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Like this?" Ben asked, holding up a tangle of nylon thread, his hazel eyes darting to Edward for approval. Edward chuckled, a sound rusty from disuse but genuine. "Close. Here, let me show you." He leaned forward, his larger hands guiding Ben's, untangling the mess with a patience he hadn't known he possessed. "Your mom used to say I was hopeless with this stuff, but I figured it out eventually. She'd sit by the river laughing while I cursed the knots." Ben's lips quirked into a small smile, the first Edward had seen since bringing him here 2 days ago. "She told me you liked fishing, said you'd teach me someday." The words settled over Edward like a warm blanket, tinged with the ache of Clara's absence. After the showdown with Victor and the board, he'd driven straight to Ellen's cottage, his resolve unshaken by the headlines still swirling in the city. Ellen had relented, letting Ben come with him. Not forever, she'd warned, but for a start. Now, here they were, in a house too big for its own echoes, trying to build something new from the ashes of the past. "She was right," Edward said, tying a neat knot and handing the rod back to Ben. "I haven't fished in years, but I'll teach you. We'll go down to the river tomorrow, just like she wanted." Ben nodded, his fingers tracing the rod's handle, then looked up, his voice tentative. "Why'd you stop? Fishing, I mean. Mom said it made you happy." Edward paused, the question catching him off guard. He stared into the fire, the flames dancing in a way that reminded him of Clara's quiet strength. "I got busy," he admitted, his tone soft but honest. "Building the company, chasing things I thought mattered. I forgot what happy felt, like until now." Ben tilted his head, studying him with that piercing gaze Edward was beginning to recognize as Clara's. "Mom said you'd figure it out. She was good at knowing stuff." The trust in Ben's voice hit Edward hard, a reminder of the faith Clara had held even when he'd given her no reason to. He'd walked away from her, from this boy, convinced his strength lay in control, in the empire he'd forged. But sitting here, teaching Ben to tie a knot, he felt a different kind of strength, one rooted not in power, but in presence, in the small, steady act of showing up. The front door creaked open, and Ellen stepped in, her canvas bag slung over her shoulder. She'd insisted on checking in, her protective streak as fierce as ever. She glanced at the scene, Edward and Ben by the fire, the rods leaning nearby, and her stern expression softened, just a fraction. "Looks like you're settling in," she said, setting her bag on the couch. "Didn't think you'd trade your boardroom for this, Grayson." Edward stood, brushing his hands on his pants. "Neither did I, but it's where I need to be." "How's the city?" Ellen snorted. "A mess. Victor's still pushing his story, but the board's holding off. That woman, Margaret, she's got your back, for now." "Good to know," Edward said, though the news felt distant, less urgent, than the boy beside him. He'd called Margaret that morning, tendering his resignation as chairman. Not because Victor had won, but because he'd realized the title no longer defined him. The company could thrive without him. Ben couldn't. Ellen's gaze shifted to Ben, who'd returned to his knot tying with renewed focus. "He's okay here," she said, quieter now. "But don't rush him, Edward. He's still figuring you out." "I won't," Edward promised, his voice firm. "I've got time to earn his trust, and yours." She nodded, a grudging approval, then headed for the door. "I'll be back tomorrow. Don't burn the place down." As the door clicked shut, Ben looked up, his hands stilling. "Can I call you something?" he asked, his tone hesitant but curious. Edward's heart skipped, a flicker of hope igniting. "Anything you want." "Dad," Ben said, testing the word like a new toy. "Is that okay?" For a moment, Edward couldn't speak, the weight of that single syllable pressing against his chest. He knelt again, meeting Ben's eyes, his voice thick with emotion. "Yeah, Ben, that's more than okay. It's everything." Ben smiled, a real one this time, bright and unguarded, and handed Edward the rod. "Dad, then you gotta teach me right. Mom said you'd be good at it." Edward took the rod, his hand steady despite the tremor in his soul. "I'll do my best," he said, the promise carrying more than fishing lessons. "For her, and for you." They worked in companionable silence, the fire crackling as dusk settled over the estate. Edward felt the shift, a small flame kindling where emptiness had reigned. He'd lost Clara to his own blindness, but Ben was here, a chance to live the honor she'd believed in. He thought of her notebook, her words. "I hope you're ready now." He was ready. Not perfect, not whole, but ready to be the father she'd trusted he could become. The room glowed with the light of that small flame, a quiet warmth that didn't erase the past but softened its edges. Tomorrow they'd fish by the river, a simple act tying them to Clara's memory. Tonight it was enough to sit together, to build something new, not with money or power, but with the steady hands of a man learning to hold on. The autumn breeze carried the scent of fallen leaves along the Hudson's banks, where Edward Grayson sat on a weathered blanket, a fishing rod resting loosely in his hands. The river flowed steady and calm before him, its surface glinting with the soft gold of a late September morning. Beside him, Ben crouched low, his small fingers working a worm onto a hook with the careful precision Edward had taught him over the past few weeks. The boy's tongue poked out in concentration, a sight that tugged a quiet smile from Edward's lips. For the first time in years, the world felt still. Not the stillness of isolation he'd known in his penthouse days, but a peace born of presence, of purpose. "Got it," Ben announced, holding up the baited hook triumphantly. "Think the fish'll bite today, Dad?" Edward chuckled, the sound warm and unforced. They'd better. We've got Clara's luck on our side, don't we? Ben grinned, casting his line with a flick of his wrist, the motion smoother than it had been when they'd started. Yeah, she'd say we're naturals. The mention of Clara settled over them like the river's gentle current, not a weight, but a thread tying them together. Edward glanced at the boy, his son, marveling at how quickly Ben had become the center of his days. The mansion in Westchester was no longer a hollow shell. It echoed with Ben's laughter, the clatter of fishing gear, the soft hum of stories read by the fire. Edward had traded his chairman's seat for this, a life unburdened by boardroom battles defined instead by the quiet dignity of being a father. He'd made it official a week ago, after Victor's lies unraveled under scrutiny. The forged documents had crumbled, dates misaligned, signatures too perfect to be real, and Margaret had rallied the board to clear Edward's name. But he'd already walked away, handing over grace and energy to a successor who could carry it forward. The headlines had shifted, some calling it a fall from grace, others a noble retreat. Edward didn't care. His worth wasn't in the papers anymore. It was here, in the boy casting beside him, in the legacy Clara had left behind. Ben's line tugged, and he let out a whoop, reeling it in with a grin that lit up the riverbank. Edward leaned over, steadying the rod as a small base broke the surface, its scales flashing in the sun. "Nice one," he said, helping Ben unhook it. "Your mom would have been proud." "Think so?" Ben asked, cradling the fish before releasing it back into the water. "I know so," Edward replied, his voice soft but certain. "She always saw the best in things, fish, rivers, people, especially me." Ben nodded, settling back onto the blanket, his gaze drifting to the water. "She said you'd come back someday. Said you'd be good at this, being with me." Edward's chest tightened, a swell of gratitude for Clara's faith cutting through the lingering guilt. He'd failed her once, blinded by a pride that mistook wealth for strength. But she'd believed in him, even then, and that belief had guided him here, to this river, this moment, this chance to be the man she'd seen beneath the suits and skyscrapers. He reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out a folded letter he'd written the night before. It was addressed to Clara, its words simple but heavy with the weight of his journey. "I found it, Clara. The honor you hoped I'd see. It's not in the company, not in the money. It's in Ben, in us, in the river you loved. I'm sorry I took so long, but I'm here now. Thank you for believing I could be." He hadn't shown it to anyone. Not Ellen, not Ben. But he'd leave it here, by the water, a quiet offering to the woman who'd shaped them both. "Dad," Ben said, breaking his reverie. "What's that?" Edward hesitated, then handed it to him. "A letter to your mom. I figured she should know how we're doing." Ben unfolded it, his eyes scanning the lines, then looked up with a small, knowing smile. "She'd like this. Can we put it by the river?" "Yeah," Edward said, his voice thick. "Let's do that." They stood together, walking to the water's edge where a flat stone marked their spot. Edward tucked the letter beneath it, the paper fluttering briefly before settling into place. Ben added a pebble of his own, a silent echo of Clara's habit, and they stepped back, watching the river carry on as if it understood. Back at the blanket, Edward pulled out a thermos of coffee and a juice box for Ben, the routine familiar now. "I've been thinking," he said, pouring the steaming liquid into a mug, "about starting something, a fund maybe for kids like you who lose their parents too soon. Call it the Clara Grayson Foundation. What do you think?" Ben's eyes widened, the juice box pausing halfway to his mouth. "For real? Like, to help them?" "For real," Edward confirmed. "I've got more money than we'll ever need. Might as well use it for something good, something your mom would have done." "That's cool," Ben said, his grin returning. "Mom would say it's perfect." Edward smiled, the idea taking root. It wasn't a grand gesture to reclaim his name. It was a quiet one, a way to honor Clara's sacrifice with the resources he'd once hoarded. He'd fund it himself, no fanfare, no press conferences, just a steady stream of support, like the river they sat by, flowing where it was needed most. The sun climbed higher, warming the air, and Ben cast his line again, chattering about school, fish, and the treehouse he wanted to build. Edward listened, his heart full in a way he'd never known. The city's chaos felt a world away. Victor's threats, the board's doubts, the life he'd left behind. Here, with Ben, he'd found a peace that didn't erase the past but redeemed it, one small moment at a time. "Dad," Ben said suddenly, his line still as he turned to Edward. "Do you think Mom sees us?" Edward looked out at the river, its surface catching the light like a mirror to the sky. "Yeah, Ben," he said, his voice steady with conviction. "She's always here. In the river, in you, in us. She sees everything." Ben nodded, satisfied, and reeled in his line. Edward watched him, the boy who'd pulled him back to the man he was meant to be. His honor wasn't in the empire he'd abandoned, but in this, the quiet strength of a father, the enduring love of a family, the peace of a river that flowed on, unbroken. And so, by the river's edge, he found what no empire could give, peace forged in love, a dignity earned through sacrifice. It's a story that reminds us all, true honor isn't in what we take, but in what we give back. Did this journey touch your heart? Drop a like if it did, and subscribe to catch more tales of resilience and redemption. Share your thoughts below. What does honor mean to you? Let's keep the conversation flowing.